Hello everybody! With the new inclusions from Historic Horizons, many new decks have emerged. I'm only going to be going over relevant decks that you'll see in the ladder, and they don't necessarily have to be the most powerful, but just powerful enough to win a game of Magic. And this is going to be in no order of how powerful they are. And without further ado, here are the biggest winners in Historic Horizons. First, we got the humans. Initially, I did not think that humans got enough to actually build a deck together, because I was only comparing it to the modern list. However, as it turns out, there are quite a bit going on already, especially in the colors of white. With the immense popularity that is Jeskai Control decks, Creativity decks, and Tipple's Trickery, no matter the place, whether it be best out of 1 or best out of 3, this tax style deck with cards like Esper Sentinel, Thalia, Elite Spellbinder have become very popular in the meta. The new cards from Historic Horizons are Esper Sentinel, bringing this pseudo card draws and tax effects, and then you got Thalia's Lieutenant allowing humans decks to have a go wide strategy, and the Ranger Captain of EOs allowing human decks to go right under the key turns that would otherwise be a board wipe against control decks. All of these things together is making humans deck thrive in the meta right now, although its biggest arch nemesis is probably gonna be like tribal decks such as Elves or Merfolks, which also became better with Historic Horizons. The Elves deck can go wider and taller than humans decks can ever hope to dream of. With Historic Horizons, they received few new cards that made the deck more resilient against control decks. Two of these key cards are Freyalise and Skyshroud Lookout. I found these cards to be exceptionally powerful against control decks, especially Freyalise, allowing elf decks to attack from a different angle that wasn't quite possible before, which is the fact that it is a planeswalker. Remember the times when you thought you had a good hand going Llanowar Elf into Elvish Archdruid? And your friendly neighborhood Jeskai Control deck just comes by and zaps your Archdruid with Helix. Well, now you can go straight into Planeswalkers instead. So turn 1, Llanowar Elf, and then turn 2, you play Freyalise, and you uptick on the Llanowar Elf, untapping, making it 2/2, and dropping another 1 mana card on that turn. That is 4 mana worth of stuff you dropped on turn 2. It's absolutely insane. One mistake I often see with Freyalise is people like to downtick a lot. When their hand is relatively full, like I would consider, like if you have 4 cards in your hand, there's no reason for you to downtick. Why do they do that? Don't downtick with Freyalise. If you read your ultimate on Freyalise, it conjures a card called Regal Force, which means that it'll create a Regal Force onto the battlefield, allowing you to draw for every creature on the board. If your hand is relatively full, you don't need to downtick to grab an elf from your deck. Just keep dropping your threats instead, and make sure you uptick a few turns, then you'll be able to refill your hand using your ultimate, which is incredibly easy to do, by the way. And that's because it is a 3 mana planeswalker that can come down on turn 2. By the time it's turn 5 and you're playing against control, you'll be able to ultimate drawing you a bunch of cards instead. So I've been talking about how great Freyalise is all this time, but there will be times when you want to drop her from the deck, and that is if you're playing against fellow creature decks without much removal, or if you're playing mirror matches too much. In this case, the Crater Hoof package actually shines much better. So depending on the meta, you can opt to switch in and out of the main deck to your liking. If you're playing best out of 3, you can play the Crater Hoof package first, and then side in Freyalise later. And this is a perfectly fine strategy. Next up on the list is vampires. I'll be honest, Vampire isn't everywhere in the meta. But the people that have played Vampires or faced Vampire decks will know. Cordial Vampire is an absolute monster of a card for Vampires. If you see this little guy come down, you just can't attack ever, or block for that matter. The board just becomes a stalemate, a complete stasis. Once stuff starts dying, whether it be their creature or your creature, it starts putting +1/+1 counter on every vampire they control. The Vampire Tribal is already backed up by one of the best planeswalkers in the historic format, which is Sorin. Again, a 3-mana planeswalker like Freyalise. The only reason Vampire isn't absolutely dominating the format is, well, there aren't that many good vampires. Next, we got Merfolks. So Merfolks received many new additions to set, which made the archetype much better, but not enough to make them overpowering, but enough to make a splash on the meta in my opinion. They received Shoreline Scout, Master of Pearl Trident, and Civilian of Sea and Sky. Amongst these three, I think Shoreline Scout and Civilian has to be the best addition to the Merfolk tribes. Shoreline Scout being able to turn a Merfolk into a land is just absolutely crazy, because it allows their deck to run lower land count, which is huge because I'm pretty sure recent Merfolk lists started to run things like Memory Lapse, because they can run a lower land count in the deck, because now they have open space to add new cards. And not to mention, Civilian makes board wiping a complete nightmare for control decks. Unfortunately, I don't see Merfolks developing as a deck any further, as in tuning the deck to be stronger in the future. Just because there aren't that many Merfolks available, but they are still a powerful deck that should be able to function in the meta, just not the tier 1 status. Then we got the red base aggro decks. They received the Dragon Ray Channeler, and this card literally been in every single red decks as far as I know, such as Phoenix decks. They use this as a means to fill their graveyard using the Surveil mechanic, and pure red aggro decks are using this alongside with cards like Roiling Vortex on enchantment due to Tybalt's Trickery decks. And not only does it counter the Trickery deck, it's also a rare card type that can also be used to activate the Delirium requirement for the Dragon Ray Channeler. People are also using Dragon Ray Channeler alongside Bowman Courier, which is also both artifact and creature at the same time. And not to mention, alongside the Dragon Ray Channeler, they also got Unholy Heat, which does 6 damage with Delirium active. It can even kill Teferi the moment it comes down at the expense of measle 1 mana. And on top of that, they also got a massive burn spell, scales over time, which is Static Discharge. I think a lot of people kind of glossed over this card at the start, but I think just because it's a sorcery, but I think with time people are realizing how powerful this spell is. So the first time it's 3 damage, then 4 damage, and then later on for 2 mana, it's dealing 5 damage to the face. Another aggro deck that emerged with this set are the Shamans. Previously, it wasn't even a deck before, but with Mnemonic Prodigy and Rage Forger, the deck came to life and doing pretty well in the latter actually. What's really nice is that these two cards have established a pretty solid backbone to the Shaman archetypes for the future. So with any new Shamans that gets introduced later, the deck will become more and more powerful. So even though I do think that if you don't have Harmonic Prodigy up, or if you don't draw into Rage Forger, the Shaman deck can be a little bit underwhelming at times. But the fact that the deck can be so explosive, I think it deserves a mention in this list. Speaking of new decks, another deck that emerged with Historic Horizon is Enchantress decks. That is entirely based on enchantments. Although the deck isn't as powerful as many other new decks out there, but some people are still having pretty good success with it. The addition of Sanctum Weaver allows them to gain over the top mana out of nowhere, And Scythes Harvest Hand, not only being an enchantment itself, it draws you a card and life for every enchantment casted, giving enchantment-based decks a low-cost draw engine. And lastly, the addition of Sterling Grove makes all the enchantments on board have Shroud, which is effectively a stricter hexproof, making them unable to be targeted by spells or abilities, which is good and bad at the same time, because although the deck is entirely focused on enchantment, you still can't use Calyx, which I think is one of the best planeswalkers in the format, without a home, and still can't find a home. Sterling Grove is too good not to play in your enchantment decks, but Calyx's minus ability to exile a creature and enchantment becomes completely useless if they're both on the field at the same time. So it is so unfortunate that we can't actually play Calyx in the deck. The next deck is, well, Scales, which is the name of the deck, coming from the card itself, Hardened Scales. I'm sure a lot of people were excited to see this card coming to Historic. Basically, the Scales card gives you more counters every time you apply the +1/+1 counters, and allowing for creatures to grow very tall, very fast. And if you can somehow give the creature, or if the creature already has trample on it, it can allow the deck to like have a very explosive turn and allowing the deck to one-shot you into the dome. So people have been trying to play this type of deck with counters on counter action since forever, but we just never had the card Hardened Scales. People are playing kind of like a quote-unquote gimped version of Scales deck, with cards like Conclave Mentor or Winding Constrictor to mimic the power level of a one-drop enchantment. But it's really hard to do that considering it's just a 1-mana enchantment. So being an enchantment rather than a creature is infinitely better and harder for the opponent to remove. And as such, Hardened Scales is what makes the deck very powerful. So I would say the Scales deck is one of the biggest winners in Historic Horizons because they did receive an archetype defining card, despite the deck not doing particularly well, but still powerful enough to compete in the ladder. Next, we got my personal favorite, the Blink or the Flicker deck. With Historic Horizons, we've received Soul Herder and Restoration Angel. This type of deck likes to play a lot of enter the battle effects with triggers and tries to flicker them into exile and then back into the battlefield to trigger again. I think the archetype definitely has a lot of room to be explored further, because what a lot of people are doing at the moment is using Collected Company to cheat out more creatures, which is the most popular strategy at the moment amongst creature decks. There might be more control-styled Blink or Flicker decks with counter spells and removal spells in the future, with more Restoration Angels, of course, because right now, Restoration Angel isn't really being played in most decks. But as of now, at least the creature-only strategy with Collected Company seems very effective. And next up, we got the Reanimator deck. So before Historic Horizon, we were only working with Unburial Rites to resurrect the creature from our graveyard, which could be too slow against some decks. Or say you are going second and you weren't able to dig through your deck fast enough for the turn 4 Unburial Rites. These things do happen. But now, coupled with the new cards Priest of the Fellrites, allowing you to return a creature card from graveyard on turn 3, which can be game-winning, or you have Seasoned Pyromancer, stalling for better draws, or just using it for bidding key cards to the graveyard, and making 2 tokens at the same time, allowing you to chomp block against aggressive decks, is absolutely huge for the Reanimator deck. Oh, and let's not forget the Bone Shard, allowing you to kill creatures or planeswalkers and allowing you to bin cards to the graveyard from the hand. Everything just synergizes so well now. The only downside to this deck would be the fact that, well, our Reanimator targets are, you know, kind of lacking, I would say. We got Elish Norn, Massacre War or Sarah's Emissary, which does absolutely demolish creature decks, but there are no solid answers to control decks. Coma is indeed a very good creature against control decks, but the fact that this is an off-colored creature makes it kinda hard for game 2 and 3. So if you're playing best out of 3, where they bring in graveyard hate, it is absolutely vital for our game plan to be able to overcome the hate card they bring in to the table. But right now, it can't really overcome that, and that's because we can't actually play the card itself. Since Coma is, you know, green-blue, we don't play green-blue as a land. So until we get a creature like, I don't know, Archon of Cruelty, the deck won't be anything game-breaking, I think, but nevertheless, the new additions to Historic did end up bringing a new archetype to the format, so I would say it is a big win. And finally, I'm going to talk about these last two cards, which I think are the biggest cards to Historic. First, we got Ravenous Squirrel. Why is this card so freaking huge? An actual factual 1-mana 1/1 that you'll see it swinging at you for 6/6 on like turn 3. I think the first 2 weeks people have been kind of sleeping on this card because everybody was like trying to try the new archetypes, but we all knew, right, sacrifice style decks were already powerful, so I think people were kind of trying to move away from that and trying something different. So this little squirrel coupled with Cat Oven can become so huge so quickly that it's unbelievable to think that this would be a mere uncommon. I mean, just look at Pellet Collector. It's not even as powerful as this card, and it's a rare. I'm going to say it right now, but be prepared to see this card a lot more in the future. And lastly, drumroll, Sarah's Emissary. So I briefly talked about it when I was talking about the Reanimator deck, but in Creativity deck, this deck is just wrecking havocs, and that's primarily because it's in a Jeskai shell. They have the most broken spells in Historic format right now. You got the Memory Lapse, Expressive Iteration, Prismari Command. They even used to have Brainstorm, for God's sake. Being able to put 2 Sarah's Emissary onto the board with Indomitable Creativity means that most decks will have to dedicate like 7 to 8 Cyborg slots just for that deck. I mean, it is definitely the boogeyman of the format, right? Although the amount of players that you see on the ladder with the deck has definitely diminished. But if you aren't prepared for this deck, you will just automatically lose because you'll have no ways of answering the Sarah's Emissary. But anywho, I think I've gone over all the decks that are currently flourishing in the Historic meta right now. Thanks to the addition of Historic Horizons, I've definitely glossed over some cards intentionally. Although there's definitely some archetypes out there that you can scrounge up to make up a deck. Like, for example, like Slivers or Affinity, for example. But honestly, like, they just aren't good enough to compete in the ladder at the moment for various reasons, right? Such as lack of good cards or just not having good enough answers to the meta, and etc. But I think, yeah, that's all for now. I hope you found this informative, and be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't, and I hope to see you next time.